Hi, everyone, and welcome to Bridging the Gap podcast, where we kind of explore the complexities of the gender wage gap and what we can do to create meaningful change. I'm your host, Ariana Banerjee, and this is my co-host, Peyton Morris.
Hello.
She studies feminist theory, so she'll be adding some input on this podcast. I'm glad you're here. So now you might be wondering, why are we doing a video recorded podcast instead of just an audio podcast? That's a good question. I think representation matters, and I think adding a visual element fosters a stronger connection with you, the audience. And because this video isn't just about abstract numbers, it's also about real people, real impacts, and real stories. Plus, with a topic as intersectional as this, touching on gender, race, and queerness, I think having a face-to-face interaction creates transparency and accountability. So my hope is that seeing this discussion unfold makes it more tangible and actionable for you. So moving on to the nitty-gritty, I guess. To understand the wage gap and kind of address it, I'll start by saying it's been persistent for decades. I mean, continuing to affect women across various industries and levels of employment. We see it every day. I mean, despite advocates or advancements even in gender equality, women, especially of color, earn less than their male counterparts for doing the same work. And this issue, however, is not confined to the broader pay disparities between men and women, but it becomes even more pronounced when viewed through the lens of intersectionality. And this is women of color, particularly Black and Latino women, as well as Indigenous women. They experience a wage gap that is even more substantial than that faced by their white counterparts. Now, this was an interview done with Siri Chalazi, who was at the Harvard Kennedy University in school, and she was getting interviewed kind of just about the general gender wage gap to get more information on this back in 2020. So, and then some additional data from the National Women's Law Center is that Black women earn only 62 cents for every dollar earned by a white man, and Latinas fare even worse, earning only 54 cents. Now, this disparity is further compounded by structural inequalities such as educational barriers, lack of access to high-paying industries, and insufficient workplace protections. So, the root causes of this inequity are deeply embedded in historical, economic, and social systems that essentially devalue the labor of women, and especially women of color, as we've kind of mentioned. In 2020, the gender pay gap stood at 18% overall, a figure that has remained stubbornly high despite numerous policy interventions and corporate efforts. Chalazi also mentions this in her interview. The gender wage gap is not simply an abstract statistic, but a direct reflection of unequal opportunities, societal underevaluation of women, and their labor, as well as systemic barriers to career advancements. So furthermore, the issue becomes even more complex when considering the role of educational attainment. While women have surpassed men in earning degrees in recent years, their achievements do not correlate to higher pay. This was said by Richard Reeves, one of the lead writers for the American Institute for Boys and Men. So this gap is not just about inequality in the workplace, but about how our societal systems continue to disadvantage certain groups based on race, gender, and other intersecting factors. Would you say, you kind of have noticed this throughout time and throughout, your learnings on feminist theory?
Definitely. Intersectionality
Yeah.
is a huge confounding factor.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, we see it here, and in this presentation, we'll kind of explore the nature of the gender wage gap, the factors that contribute to its persistence, and the importance of addressing this inequity for the health of the economy. By examining data, real-world examples, and policy discussions, we'll kind of show that closing the wage gap is not really a matter of fairness, but kind of an essential step towards economic stability and growth. We will also explore potential solutions such as pay transparency that have the potential to create lasting changes that ensure that women, especially women of color, are compensated fairly for their labor. So, through this discussion, it becomes clear that bridging the gender wage gap is not just a matter of social justice, but it is an economic imperative. Addressing this divide requires us to confront the deep-rooted structures of inequality that persist in our workplace and society. Only by recognizing and kind of dismantling these barriers can we create a truly equitable labor market where all individuals, regardless of gender or race, have the opportunity to thrive and succeed. Because I kind of believe if you're putting in that work yourself, you should be able to enjoy the fruits of your labors, right? I mean, we're going to get our college degree, and how unfair would it be if we earned less than a white man?
Which is probably what will happen, and
And it
more likely
probably
than
is.
not.
Yeah, this is true. Although Asian women earn 92% of the dollar, which is kind of bizarre. But Asian women, I think, is a very broad stat.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, well, moving on. So, firstly, the gender wage gap and its root causes. So, Chilazi kind of goes off in her interview and kind of really checks out these like deep-rooted causes, and that's kind of the bones of her interview. So, most of what I will be spewing statistically or conceptually will be from Siri Chilazi. So, the gender gap has kind of existed for centuries, as soon as women were allowed to work. But its persistence in modern society kind of speaks to broader societal and systemic issues that limit women's economic opportunities. According to a report by Siri Chilazi from the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, women on average earn 82 cents for every dollar earned by men in the United States. However, this statistic is not monolithic. When broken down by race, it becomes evident that women of color face an even more significant wage gap. Asian women make 90 cents on the dollar, white women earn 79 cents, Black women earn only 62 cents, and Latino face the largest disparity, earning only 54 cents. This was kind of prefaced before, but just to kind of reiterate that statistic, it is very real and it is very much happening in the world. These statistics kind of underscore the intersectionality of the wage gap, where gender is compounded by racial and ethnic disparities. So, the structural factors that contribute to these disparities are numerous. I mean, women, particularly women of color, are more likely to be employed in low-wage industries such as retail, hospitality, and healthcare, which offer limited opportunities for career advancements. Moving from that, racial and gender biases in hiring, promotion, and pay practices also play a significant role in perpetuating the wage gap. And these biases are often difficult to detect as they are woven into the fabric of organizational cultures and societal norms, making them resistant to change. And I'm sure you could probably speak on that part. I mean, just it kind of being woven into societal norms, having that hospitality nature jobs, like being a teacher. How many of your teachers growing up were women?
The more subordinate jobs
Exactly.
are put on women.
Absolutely.
Domestic.
Domestic and hospitable and caring almost. So, the role of minimum wage, this is kind of a slip in the topic, but with minimum wage increasing, it and how it kind of relates to narrowing the wage gap or not narrowing the wage gap, I guess. So, I guess moving with that, one way to address the gender wage gap is by increasing the federal minimum wage, which has remained stagnant at $7.25 an hour since 2009. This was according to Dan Price, founder of Gravity Payments. Raising the minimum wage would just disproportionately benefit women of color who are more likely to be employed in low-wage jobs, says Price. While a federal wage increase would benefit many low-income workers, it would have the most significant impact on Black and Latino women who are overrepresented in minimum wage jobs. So I think the $77.25 is a little bit skewed from now. I know here in Fort Collins in Colorado, it is $14.50 for
Yeah,
minimum
but
wage.
federal, like, that's the legal minimum.
Exactly. Yes, that's very true. So, however, Price also points out that a rise in the minimum wage could lead some businesses to outsource labor to countries with lower wage standards, which kind of has the possibility of limiting the effectiveness of such a policy on the U.S. economy as a whole. So, despite this raising the minimum wage, is still one of the most direct ways to reduce the wage gap, particularly for women who are employed in low wage service oriented jobs. Moreover, as Mountain Law, located in Austin, Texas, notes, women are responsible for substantial portions of consumer spending in the US economy, and by increasing their wages, their purchasing power would be boosted, stimulating economic growth. So, not only is this just going to benefit just women or just women of color or just women in the LGBTQ plus community, it will benefit women and men and just the economy in general. So, to move forward with this idea of intersectionality, the wage gap is not really an issue of gender inequality, but it is also deeply intertwined with race. The term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, she hosted a TED Talk a few years back. She refers to how different aspects of a person's identity, such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status, interact to create unique experiences of discrimination and disadvantage. So, for me, being a bisexual woman of color, I have a different experience with intersectionality as I'm queer, as I am a person of color, and I'm a woman. And those struggles all had this crossroad that don't seem to be addressed as a whole, but more by each issue. And I'm sure you face that too, also being queer. So moving forward, for women of color, the wage gap is not like just the result of gender-based pay disparities, but also reflects racial discrimination in the workplace. And as noted by the American Association of University Women, studies have shown that even after controlling for factors such as occupation, education, and experience, women continue to earn less than men. In fact, the AAUW's research indicates that a gap of 7% in pay exits between male and female graduates, even when factors like college major and GPA are accounted for. So this unexplained pay gap raises questions about the underlying biases that affect women's pay, particularly women of color. When gender and race intersect, women of color face compounded disadvantages that limit their earning potential and economic opportunities. So maybe there needs to be more transparency with pay or equal lot payments. So let's kind of talk about the importance of pay transparency and equal pay laws. So one of the most effective ways to close this gap is through pay transparency, I believe, which requires companies to disclose the wages of employees by gender, race, and job category. So in 2017, the Trump administration rolled back on an Obama-era initiative that aimed to require companies with over 100 employees to report this pay data to the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And this initiative was designed to increase transparency and help identify pay disparities, particularly for women of color, but even just women or just men or just pay in general. So the National Women's Law Center successfully challenged this decision in court, arguing that rollback violated federal law and undermined efforts to close the wage gap. This legal victory emphasizes the importance of maintaining and expanding pay transparency efforts. By requiring companies to disclose pay information, workers can more easily identify whether they are being paid fairly, and employers will be held accountable for any disparities. Moreover, the EEOC's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan outlines several measures to address pay discrimination and promote equal employment opportunities. a San Francisco-based tech firm. In 2015, Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, hope that's right, was confronted with evidence of a significant gender pay gap within his company. And initially skeptical, Benioff eventually reviewed an internal audit and found that women were paid roughly 7% less than men for similar roles at Salesforce. So, in response, the company allocated $3 million to address the pay disparity, ensuring that female employees received fair compensation and had more opportunities for advancement. While Salesforce actions were commendable, this case also illustrates a critical point. Even progressive companies can have pay disparities. If they do not actively monitor and address these issues, many companies, especially in male-dominated industries such as tech, face challenges in achieving gender equity in pay. So this is why it's kind of essential for laws and regulations to be put into place, such as pay transparency and equal pay legislation, to hold companies accountable for addressing these disparities. Salesforce's success in closing the gender wage gap can be replicated across industries, but only if companies are incentivized to prioritize equal pay. I remember reading about this and kind of listening to this interview that he did with some reporter for the news, and like it's mentioned before, he was very skeptical and he was like, oh, there's no way this is happening. Like, our company is so renowned for how we treat our workers and our employers. Employees. So I would have a hard time believing that. Turns out that actually did happen, and he was able to fix that, which, like I said, is very commendable. But more structural solutions to address the gender wage gap. In addition to the steps already discussed, several structural solutions could help address the gender wage gap. One potential solution is the implementation of public record requirements, which would kind of mandate the companies to maintain records of their pay and audits as public documents. By making this information accessible, workers, advocacy organizations, and policymakers could track progress toward pay equity and hold companies accountable for any disparities. So, another potential solution is to offer tax incentives to those that are not so inclined to comply with such transparency and having that as public record. So maybe states that lean more to the right, that don't really, or states that genuinely don't think it exists. I mean, those tend to be more right-leaning states, but not to say all of them. So I think offering these tax incentives to companies that maintain high levels of pay transparency and work towards closing the wage gap. So, for example, companies that voluntarily conduct pay audits and address any disparities could receive tax breaks or other financial incentives. And this approach would provide business with a direct financial benefit for prioritizing pay equity, making it more likely that they would take meaningful steps towards closing the wage gap. So, finally, states could probably tie employment licensing to compliance with equal pay laws, making it a requirement for businesses to meet certain standards in order to operate legally. This is kind of a more, I don't know, a tyrant way to go about this, but it is a measure that could be taken, and it would encourage businesses to adopt fair pay practices, ensuring that they are held accountable for wage disparities. While such an opportunity may seem kind of authoritarian, as said, it could be an effective way to ensure that companies comply with those equal pay standards. But to conclude our Bridging the Divide podcast, I would just like to say that the gender wage gap is really a complex issue that requires a multifaceted approach to address. And by raising the minimum wage, implementing pay transparency, or enforcing equal pay laws and adopting innovative solutions like public record requirements and tax incentives, we can really make meaningful steps towards closing this wage gap, ensuring that all workers are paid fairly for their labor. Women, particularly women of color, are critical drivers of the U.S. economy, and ensuring that they are receiving equal pay for equal work is not only a matter of social justice, but also a necessity for economic stability and growth. To bridge this divide, we must collectively challenge the system the systemic barriers that perpetuate gender and racial inequality in the workplace. And by working together through policy, leadership, and corporate responsibility, we can build a more equitable and inclusive economy where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. In all, that is pretty much all we got for you. Thanks, Peyton, for joining me today.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Of course, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Bridging the Gap.
Goodbye.
Bye.